Hello there, this is Yana Smakula for Paper Tray Ink, and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing simple to make and quick to mass produce modern looking stationery-like stamped cards. All of my cards say just a note, but the sentiment can be easily adjusted to anything else. These can be miss you, happy birthday, or other cards. This basic design can have many variations and adaptations to it. If you look closely, you'll see that there is a faint, dry embossing on my stamped panel. There are these horizontal lines in between the stamped flowers. You can choose to add these or not and keep your card just stamped. Here is another card where the lines aren't stamped but are heat embossed in gold embossing powder, adding a lot of interest to this otherwise very simple card. I will be using several blue ink pads for my stamping today, as blue just happens to be a favorite of mine lately. However, this monochromatic design can be done using other colors. I've stamped one card in pink and also did another one in gray. And I also have a set of brown ink pads and purple ink pads sitting on my desk, and I'll be stamping same ideas using these colors as soon as I finish this video. It's helpful to have at least 3 colors of ink, better yet 4, to have great results. For my blue cards, I used 4 ink colors: Spring Rain, Blueberry Sky, Dark Indigo, and Enchanted Evening. For my pink and gray cards, I only used 3 ink pads. I started working on my cards by masking the sentiment area first. Since I was planning to make 1-layer cards, I didn't want to add another layer onto my card. I used a die from the Little Labels stamp and die set and cut a label out of thin paper. I used removable adhesive and adhered it onto my white cardstock panel that was cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I don't like stamping directly onto the base of my cards when I'm making 1-layer projects, as I prefer to stamp on a panel and later adhere that panel onto the base of my card. Plus, I knew I will be doing a lot of dry embossing and heat embossing here, so I needed to be able to manipulate the stamped panel, and I wasn't sure if I would be able to do that as easily had I done my stamping on the front of the card base. I picked several floral images from the Flower Power stamp set and assigned each color of ink to each flower, so to speak. So I stamped 3 large flowers and used just the Enchanted Evening ink color for all 3 of those. The Flower Power stamp set is a great floral set. There's a vase included here, so you can stamp floral arrangements in a vase, and there are also stems for the flowers, and there are leaves as well. You can also use your flowers on their own, like I'm doing here, to stamp a pattern or a background. And really, you can stamp patterns like this one using many other images, not just flowers. In one of my videos I shared earlier this year, I used a Paper Tray Ink Palm Prints stamp set to create a tropical pattern. Be sure to watch that video to get more pattern stamping ideas. I have worked on a test pattern prior to stamping this one, so I already know and I already have a general idea in mind of where I want to place my images, what florals I want to use, and what colors I want. I used the lightest color of ink for my second large flower and used the other 2 blue ink pads to stamp smaller flowers in this pattern. I was stamping 2 patterns at once. This is why I was using my stamp positioner tool. But if you're stamping just one pattern, you don't really need to use it. These can be just as easily stamped with a clear block, and my other cards, the one that was stamped in gray and pink, were stamped using a clear block. These flowers, in a way, are layering images. There is an additional detail layer, 1 layer for each of those flowers, that you can stamp in another color of ink. Since I was going for a monochromatic look, I used gold embossing powder instead for my detail, and I'll show you that in just a minute. Now, if you have trouble coming up with patterns like these, it's helpful to look up some images online. For example, you can look up a floral dress or a floral notebook and try to recreate that pattern using the stamps that you have in your stash. Of course, you won't be able to create the exact same pattern, but it is a very helpful exercise that will help you become more confident and more skilled when stamping backgrounds like this. Moving on to heat embossing. To make sure my backgrounds are dry, I'm using my heat tool and just going over the panels to dry the ink. I'm going to remove the masks that masked the sentiment area. I have a little bit leftover adhesive there, so I'm just going to clean that up using a pencil eraser. And you can also clean that up using your finger. Just rub that area with your finger. Next, I'm going to prep my panel with an anti-static powder tool to make sure my embossing is going to be nice and clean. And we'll go ahead and stamp the frame in that open space in clear sticky ink, and we'll cover that with gold embossing powder. Like I mentioned, these florals all have at least one additional layer to them. So I'm going to stamp that layer using same clear sticky ink, and we'll add gold embossing powder as an accent. And again, you can go with another color of embossing powder if you like. It really doesn't have to be gold. I'm going to add embossing powder to every section, and will then heat set it with my heat gun to make sure I do not overheat this panel. I do not want it warping, so applying a minimum amount of heat is helpful here. Finally, I'm stamping the sentiment inside the frame, and the sentiment I picked reads just a note, hello. I already love how clean and modern this panel looks, and you can use it as is, but I wanted to add some dry embossed detail to the background. You can use one of your embossing folders or embossing dies to dry emboss the entire thing, but I wanted to add selective dry embossing and only dry emboss the sections that don't have any stamping. I've been loving this technique lately, and all you need to do this is a scoring board and a bone folder. Any scoring board will do for this. I'm adding score lines going horizontally at 1/2 inch intervals, and I'm avoiding the areas where the stamping is and the heat embossing is. I start with a light hand, and I increase the pressure when I go over that line a second and a third time to deepen it. It is helpful to use a straight line like a ruler or just a piece of paper to guide that bone folder to be able to avoid or skip the stamped areas, yet add the embossing where it needs to go on a straight line. Here's another panel where instead of adding the dry embossing, I used an embossing pen and added heat embossing with the help of embossing powder. I used the same idea, the same concept, but simply drew the lines with an embossing pen instead of leaving visible dry embossed indentations in my paper. I then added embossing powder. I was using brass color this time, and heat set it with my heat tool. I have to say, I love both of these looks, but adding the gold embossed lines versus the dry embossed lines is much easier on the wrist. It does take a good amount of pressure to dry emboss, so you might find it tiring, especially if you do multiple backgrounds at a time. Like I mentioned, I created several cards all following the same idea. This is the original one stamped in blue. This one here is the second blue panel. Well, you'll notice that this one has the sentiment stamped repeatedly on the background. I actually messed this panel up and stamped the first sentiment in the wrong place. I was using a stamp positioner tool to stamp it, and I simply wasn't paying attention to what I was doing, hence I stamped it incorrectly. So to salvage that piece, I stamped my sentiment multiple times to make it look like as it was intended, like that. And I really like the way it turned out. Here's a card that I did in pink, and I used hibiscus burst, autumn rose, and raspberry fizz colors for this one. I also foam mounted my sentiment panel, so this is not a one-layer card. And the last but not least is the card done in gray. And I used soft stone, stormy sea, and smoky shadow. So this finishes today's video. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you feel inspired to create. I'll see you next time. Bye!